Let me take you to Berlin. Not the Berlin of tourists and bratwurst and tidy sidewalks. I mean Berlin in the 1920s, when the air smelled like smoke and perfume and the city pulsed with jazz, secrets, and sin. At the Grand Bellevue Hotel, nestled between a theater and a bank that never quite stayed solvent, there worked a maid named Mina. Quiet, invisible, starched apron, sensible shoes. She scrubbed bathtubs, fluffed pillows, and once found a live parrot in a minibar. But Mina had a secret. She remembered everything. Who came, who left, who lied, and sometimes she wrote it down, and sometimes she passed it along. This is not a story about royalty or generals. This is about the woman who changed lives just by making beds and listening at the right time. So grab a blanket, press that like button, subscribe if you're new, and settle in. Because Mina's story, it's not one you'll find in history books, but it should have been. Berlin, spring of 1926. The city was still trying to remember how to breathe after the war. Money meant nothing, unless it was American, and cabarets sold both champagne and revolution for the same price. And at the Grand Bellevue Hotel, Mina Kraus was polishing brass doorknobs while someone in room 304 screamed about losing a silk glove. Again. Mina was 35. She wasn't beautiful, and she was glad for it. Beautiful maids got in trouble. She was plain in the best way, forgettable. She liked it that way. Her cheeks were always a little pink from the scrubbing, her hair tied in the same bun every morning. Her shoes made no sound when she walked. The Bellevue had 6 floors, 3 elevators, and one rule: see everything, say nothing. Mina obeyed. She saw broken champagne glasses that told stories louder than arguments. She saw lipstick on collars, tears on pillows, cigar burns in silk sheets. But on that morning, in Suite 502, she found something different. A blood-stained handkerchief, folded neatly, placed on the edge of the bed. No mess, no panic, no sign of struggle. Just that square of white linen embroidered with a red K and a bloom of brown red in the corner. She picked it up slowly. The blood was dry. Not fresh, but not old either. Mina had cleaned a lot of messes in her life. Vomit, ink, even one time a smashed bottle of perfume that made the whole hallway smell like violets for 3 days. But blood, real blood, was different. She stood in the room for a long time, not moving, just thinking. The guest in 502 was a man named Kurt Waldheim, tall with thick glasses and a trench coat too warm for April. He said he was a writer. All the liars said that. He was polite, tipped exactly 3 pfennigs every day, never smiled, came and went like a ghost. She put the handkerchief into her apron pocket and continued cleaning. The sheets were fine, no stains. The bathroom smelled like sandalwood soap and old cigarettes. At lunch, she sat in the break room with Greta, a younger maid who chewed her food too loudly and always talked about men. "Did you see that French guy in 207? The one with the red scarf?" Greta asked, mouth full of potato. Mina didn't answer. Greta waved a fork. "You never look at the good ones, Mina. You're gonna die surrounded by linen spray." Mina smiled faintly. That'd be peaceful. She didn't mention the handkerchief. She didn't mention the dream she'd had the night before, where she was drowning in velvet and couldn't scream. She didn't mention that Waldheim had checked out an hour ago, earlier than scheduled. No one asked why. That night, in her small apartment above a bakery that never opened on time, Mina pulled the handkerchief from her apron and laid it on the table. She stared at it under the lamp's yellow light. There were 2 things she knew for sure. First, the blood was real. Second, she had seen that exact same K monogram before. Twice. Once, on a letter poking out of a diplomat's coat pocket last week, and once, 6 months ago, on a scarf worn by a woman who never gave her name, but cried every time she looked in the mirror. Mina didn't believe in fate, but she believed in patterns, and something about this pattern felt wrong. She folded the handkerchief carefully and tucked it between the pages of an old housekeeping manual she hadn't opened in years. Then she went to bed. But she didn't sleep, because somewhere in Berlin, someone was bleeding, and Mina Kraus had just found the first thread. They say memory is a slippery thing, that it fades, softens, forgives. But Mina Kraus's memory never did any of those things. She remembered everything. And I don't mean in the way your grandma remembers your birthday. I mean everything. The exact color of her mother's favorite teacup, chipped on the rim. The smell of coal smoke in the orphanage yard. The way Sister Agnes once sighed, not loudly, just a breath, before slapping a boy across the face. Mina could recall the conversation two businessmen had in the Bellevue's lobby 3 years ago, down to the joke about Bavarian sausages. She remembered the guest who wore 2 different shoes to breakfast every day and claimed it was political performance. She remembered the name of a dog that died on the 5th floor in 1923. Leopold, a terrier with a bow tie. It wasn't a talent, it was a burden. That kind of memory, it made people nervous. Let's rewind a little. Mina was born in East Prussia in 1891, in a village with more cows than people. Her father died in a mining accident when she was 6. Her mother, well, some said she died of grief. Others said whiskey. Either way, by the time Mina turned 10, she was an orphan. She didn't cry much, but she listened, and she watched. At 13, the nuns said she had a spirit of observation. At 16, the school doctor called her dangerously attentive. That was the moment she realized something wasn't quite normal. The other girls forgot poems after a week. Mina could recite hers a year later, word for word. She tried to dim it, to forget like everyone else, but her mind clung to details like a dog to a bone. In 1918, when the war ended and the world looked like it had been set on fire and put out with vinegar, Mina was working as a laundress in Königsberg. Men came back without legs. Women carried whole families on their backs. Hope was something people bought on credit. That's when the letter arrived. It was from a cousin she'd never met, a hotel worker in Berlin. He wrote that he could get her a job. Nothing fancy, just cleaning rooms, but with good pay. And maybe something more. She took the next train west, with 1 suitcase, 3 dresses, and her mother's worn leather Bible that still smelled like tobacco. The Berlin she stepped into was chaos in pearls. It was jazz music pouring from cabaret doors, and newspapers screaming about inflation, and men selling shoelaces on the street next to stockbrokers drinking champagne. Mina hated it and loved it, and was terrified every second. The cousin, his name was Otto, turned out to be a liar. He wasn't a concierge. He was a bellhop with a gambling problem. He disappeared after 2 weeks. But before he did, he introduced Mina to a woman named Frau Liebenthal, who managed housekeeping at the Grand Bellevue. Frau Liebenthal was a fortress of a woman. Big, brisk, always smelling of starch and peppermint. She hired Mina on the spot, said she liked her hands, strong fingers but quiet ones. And Mina, as always, remembered every word. Her first day on the job, she met Greta. Greta, with the endless chatter. Greta, who would later become the closest thing to a friend Mina ever had in that city. But Mina didn't talk much, then or ever. She learned quickly. Memorized floor plans, guest preferences, laundry schedules. She noticed which rooms always needed extra towels and which ones never used the ashtrays. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed that she noticed. The first was the night manager, Herr Dorsch. One night in late autumn, he caught her adjusting the lobby clock by exactly 17 seconds. He raised an eyebrow. Most people wouldn't know it was off. She replied without looking up. It was 4 seconds slow last week. Now it's too fast. He didn't say anything more, but 2 days later, she found a small note slipped into her locker. It said, "Your memory is a gift. Use it wisely. A friend." She didn't know it then, but that was the first thread in a web that would eventually tighten around her. Back in Suite 502, the handkerchief with the red K still sat hidden in her housekeeping manual. And Mina, well, she had questions, not just about who had bled, but about why that same monogram had followed her across time, from coat pockets to scarves to nightmares she couldn't explain. If you've never been inside a grand European hotel built before the war, let me describe it for you. Imagine marble floors that echo your footsteps, no matter how softly you walk. Curtains as thick as winter coats, a chandelier the size of a small automobile, and a front desk manned by people who could judge your social standing just by how you carried your gloves. The Grand Bellevue in Berlin was exactly that kind of place. It was elegance lacquered over chaos. Opened in 1894, it had survived 2 emperors, 1 world war, and a brief fire in the kitchen caused by a drunken pastry chef. Its guest book read like a telephone directory for the elite: American oilmen, French actresses, Russian exiles, Belgian barons, and German politicians who never stayed under their real names. And then there was Mina Kraus. She didn't belong to any of those worlds, but she knew their schedules better than their wives did. By 1926, she had become a fixture at the Bellevue, a ghost in a gray uniform. Guests didn't notice her unless they needed something, but she noticed everything. Her day started at 5 in the morning, with a slice of dry bread and coffee that could have doubled as motor oil. By 5:30, she was already collecting linens, unlocking service closets, and mentally logging who was hungover, who had switched rooms overnight, and who had left a pair of men's shoes in a woman's suite. Her mind worked in quiet loops: towels, soap, scents, floorboards that creaked, beds that were left untouched or a little too ruffled. These weren't just cleaning details. They were stories. She never eavesdropped. Not really. People just forgot she was there. One guest, a theater director, once confessed to murder while brushing his teeth, completely unaware that Mina was changing out the towels 6 feet away. But the Bellevue wasn't all velvet and violins. It was also whispers in the lobby, coded notes passed between coat pockets, and a man in room 614 who once stayed for 3 months without anyone ever seeing his face in daylight. There were rumors, of course, that the concierge worked for the French embassy, that the bellboys were blackmailing wealthy clients, that the third elevator, the one that always rattled, went 1 floor lower than the blueprints showed. Mina didn't care about rumors until the day she met the man in the gray coat. It was a Thursday. Spring rain made the marble floors slick, and someone had forgotten to put out the caution sign. Mina was folding fresh towels on the cart near the lobby, humming under her breath, when he stepped out of the broken elevator. He didn't slip, didn't flinch, just walked past like he owned the place, even though he didn't match any registered guest. Tall, lean, gray overcoat, black gloves, no umbrella. His shoes weren't wet. He didn't speak to anyone, but Mina noticed the head concierge glance at him, just briefly, and then pretend he hadn't. She watched the man cross the lobby and disappear down the East Wing hallway. No key, no luggage, no badge. When she asked Greta about him later, Greta shrugged. Probably another secret lover, or a spy. Everyone's a spy these days. My aunt says even the butcher's dog works for the communists. Mina didn't laugh. That night she checked the guest registry. No one new had checked in on the East Wing that day. But in room 317, a suite that had been empty for a week, the bedsheets had been used. Not rumpled like someone sleeping, more like someone had just sat there, waiting. She told no one, just made a note in her head. 317, gray coat, silent man, concierge flinch. The next day, the elevator stopped rattling. It happened on a Tuesday. Rain again. Berlin loved its rain, thin, gray, and endlessly inconvenient. Mina had just gotten home after a double shift. Her feet ached, her apron still smelled faintly of cigars and lavender polish, and her plan for the evening was simple: bread, broth, and absolute silence. She had just unlocked her door when she heard footsteps behind her. 2 men stood at the bottom of the stairwell, not hotel guests, not neighbors, not police in uniform either, which somehow made them worse. They were dressed in dark coats. One wore gloves, though it wasn't cold. The other carried a briefcase that looked too thin to be empty and too heavy to be innocent. "Mina Kraus?" the taller one asked, as if they hadn't followed her up 3 flights to get here. She didn't answer right away, just stood in the doorway, keys in hand, mind already racing. "May we come in?" the gloved one asked. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But she stepped aside, and that was enough. Her apartment was tiny. 1 room, a narrow bed, a bookshelf made of stacked crates, a chipped teapot. They took it in with 1 sweep, not even pretending to be polite. "We have some questions," the briefcase man said. "About what?" she asked. "About the Bellevue Hotel, about a guest in Suite 502, a Mr. Waldheim." Mina didn't blink. "What about him? You cleaned the room. You saw the handkerchief." She hated that they didn't ask. They stated. Like the facts were already known, and her part was just confirmation. "Yes," she said finally. "I found it." "What did you do with it?" "I kept it." "Why?" "Because I've seen worse. Because something about it felt unfinished. Because it had a monogram I couldn't forget." But all she said was, "Curiosity." The men exchanged a look. The gloved one opened the briefcase. Inside there was a folder. Thin, gray paper. Her name printed on the top. Not a file, a dossier. The gloved man slid it onto the table, tapped it once, like punctuation. "You remember things," he said. "Very well." Mina didn't move, but her spine went cold. "What do you want?" He leaned forward. "To offer you a job, a quiet one. No contracts, no records. You stay where you are, do what you do, only you pay attention. Not to towels, to people. And then what? You write it down, pass it along. To who?" He smiled. "To us." She sat down, finally, slowly, like the air had thickened. "What if I say no?" The gloved man shrugged. "Then you don't. But people with your kind of memory, they tend to attract attention either way." The threat was polite, almost gentle. That made it worse. "And what do I get in return?" she asked. "Protection, information, maybe a few questions answered, like why Waldheim left so suddenly, or why the concierge pretends to forget you exist." She didn't answer. The gloved man stood up. "Take your time, but not too much. The city's changing, fast. You don't want to be on the wrong side of someone else's secrets." They left without touching anything. Mina sat alone for a long time. That night, she didn't boil broth, didn't read, didn't write in her notebook. She just stared at the folder they had left behind. Inside, there were 3 names. One was familiar, a guest she'd once seen crying in the elevator. Another was room 317, and the third was her own. The next day at the Bellevue, things felt different, or maybe she just noticed them differently now. The front desk clerk hesitated before greeting her. The maid Rhoda had changed. She was now assigned to a different wing. and in room 317, the man in the gray coat was gone. The bed was untouched, but the trash bin had a burnt matchstick and a torn page from a novel in Russian. She pocketed it without thinking. Later, she checked the service hallway. A folded envelope sat in the mop bucket. Her name was written on the front, just Mina. Inside, a single sentence: "Your memory is a key. Be careful what you open." Mina Kraus never thought of herself as a writer. She didn't keep a diary. Diaries were for sentimental girls and people with too much time. But after that night, after the visit from the men in gray, she began keeping a notebook. She didn't call it that, of course. She called it the list. It was a simple book. Brown leather, soft spine, no title. She bought it from a second-hand stall near Alexanderplatz for a few pfennigs. The old man who sold it to her said it had belonged to a dentist. She liked that. Dentists knew how to take notes. She didn't write paragraphs. She wrote facts. Clean, fast, precise. Room, date, time, voices, names, scents, unusual gestures, whispers through doors, codes scribbled on matchbooks. Which guests asked for extra towels even when the ones on the rack were untouched. Her handwriting was small and neat. Years of laundry slips and hotel inventory lists had trained her fingers to move quickly, silently. But now, her notes weren't for laundry. Now, they were for something else entirely. She hid the notebook in plain sight, tucked behind the fake panel in the linen closet on the third floor. The one no one touched because it smelled like mildew and reminded people of a plumbing leak from 5 years ago. Every morning before her shift, she'd slide it out, add a line or two, a face she saw, a phrase someone muttered in a phone booth, a napkin folded too carefully. Then she'd slide it back in and carry on with her day. Greta noticed, of course. Greta noticed everything except what mattered. "You've been quiet lately," she said one afternoon, sorting hand towels with a yawn. "Even more than usual. Are you in love?" Mina smiled faintly. "Not exactly." "Well, if you ever want to be, I met a man who sells chocolates and lies beautifully." Mina didn't respond. Her eyes were on the corridor. Room 412's door was cracked open, not wide, just slightly. A pair of Italian boots pointed out from under the bed. She made a mental note. Mina's days had changed, not in appearance but in texture. Every interaction now had weight. Every gesture could be a performance, and she, without quite meaning to, had become the audience. The American in room 508 had a limp he never mentioned. The Russian in 219 tipped in foreign coins, always different. The woman in 314 only smoked when she was nervous. But recently, she'd gone through an entire pack in 2 days. And yet, what disturbed her most was not what she saw. It was that someone was watching her too. It started small. A shadow on the wall that didn't match her own. A bellhop who turned too quickly when she walked past. A cleaning cart that had been moved slightly out of place when she returned from lunch. Then came the notes, short ones, folded, slipped into her apron pocket or between stacks of napkins, always typed, always unsigned. "He's not who he says he is. Check the ashtray in room 203. They're listening at the front desk." Each one sent a chill up her spine. Each one was true. But who was writing them? The man in the gray coat hadn't returned. Not that she'd seen, but that didn't mean he was gone. In room 203, just as the note said, she found a cigarette butt wrapped in newspaper. Russian print. A date circled. May 3rd. She didn't know what it meant. She added it to the list. Sometimes she wondered if she'd made a mistake, if saying yes or not saying no to the men in coats had changed something permanent in her, turned her into a piece on someone else's board. But other times, like when a wealthy guest shouted at a maid for wrinkled pillowcases, or when Greta cried silently in the laundry room after being slapped by a drunken baroness, Mina felt something else. Power. Not loud, not cruel, but quiet, steady power. Because the men in room 317 didn't know she'd memorized their faces. Because the woman in 403 had no idea someone had seen her hiding that envelope in the flower vase. Because secrets, like dust, always settled in the corners, and Mina had been trained to clean corners better than anyone. She never signed her notes. She never asked for answers. She just wrote. You didn't need to be a spy to notice it. The tension in the Grand Bellevue had started humming, low, constant, like the buzz of faulty wiring behind wallpaper. Berlin in 1926 was already a city of contradictions. Old money danced with new ideas. Marxists shared cafes with monarchists. And somewhere between the lobby bar and the top-floor suites, two very specific guests stopped pretending they didn't know each other. The Russian arrived first. He checked in under the name Mr. Ivanov, which was about as subtle as registering as Mr. German in Moscow. He spoke 5 languages but preferred silence. His shoes were polished, but the soles were worn, Mina noticed. He never requested anything. No extra towels, no tea, no help with luggage. He carried 1 suitcase and 1 book, a battered volume of Pushkin. He was placed in room 219. 3 days later, the American arrived. Tall, tan, expensive suit worn like a costume. He introduced himself as Mr. Hartley from Boston and shook hands like he was running for office. Room 512, corner suite, balcony view. He tipped everyone, even the coat rack probably, and asked Mina if she liked jazz. She said yes. He asked if she liked American jazz. She said no. Still, he smiled like she'd made a joke. They didn't speak to each other, not once, but they orbited the same places, just offbeat. Breakfast, 2 tables apart. Library, opposite corners. Cigarettes smoked at the exact same time. Different balconies, but same hour. Too exact, too clean. Mina noticed, and more importantly, they noticed her noticing. On a Wednesday, room service reported that both men had requested the same wine, a dry Riesling from the Rhine. Not exactly a secret message, but strange nonetheless. The next day, Mina entered room 219 while Ivanov was out. She cleaned quickly, efficiently, but paused when she saw the note on the desk. Not addressed, not signed. Just a single phrase in English. Your friend eats too loudly. No one else would have seen it. No one else would have understood. It wasn't a joke. It was a jab, a test, a way of saying, we're both here. We both know it. Let's not pretend anymore. She didn't take the note, just logged it in her memory and moved on. Later that evening, as she dusted the corridor near 512, she heard laughter. The American, Hartley, was entertaining a guest. Male, young voice, nervous. Mina, broom in hand, moved silently past the door. She heard 2 words that didn't fit the rest. Comrade and shipment. No one says comrade by accident in a Berlin hotel in 1926. She kept walking. That night, a new note appeared, folded in the top drawer of the service cart. Don't take sides. No signature. Again. But this time, something had changed. The note wasn't a warning. It was a plea. Someone, maybe one of the 2 men, maybe neither, was watching her watching them. Mina didn't want sides. She wanted clarity, control, clean lines, clean sheets. Instead, she was navigating a web woven by people who never slept on their own pillows. 2 days later, a suitcase went missing. Hartley, the American, accused hotel staff of theft, claimed the case contained diplomatic documents. The concierge looked terrified. The Russian said nothing, just sipped coffee in the lobby and watched the argument unfold. Mina knew the suitcase hadn't been stolen. It had been moved, swapped, planted. Whatever game they were playing, it had escalated. She wrote it all down, every detail, even the oddest part. That night, both rooms ordered identical dinners and sent back identical forks. Something was coming. Mina felt it in the floorboards. She had stepped into a dance she didn't understand, and the music was speeding up. There were things in the Bellevue that no one talked about, like the third elevator that rattled at odd hours, or the corridor on the 5th floor where light bulbs always seemed to flicker, or the trap door in the linen room, the one tucked behind the shelves, hidden in the shadow of industrial steam pipes. Most of the staff didn't even know it existed, and those who did called it the dumbwaiter to nowhere. But Mina knew better, because one night, just past midnight, she saw a hand reach through it, and that hand was holding a piece of paper with her name written on it. Let me rewind a little. The linen room wasn't glamorous. It smelled like bleach and boiled fabric. The floor was always damp, and someone was always yelling about miscounted pillowcases. Mina liked it. No guests ever came there, and Greta rarely stayed long. It was where she went to think, to breathe. The trapdoor was built into the back wall, hidden behind stacks of folded sheets. It was the size of a small suitcase, made of iron with a brass latch. No label, no lock, just there, unnoticed. One night, while reorganizing linens, a task she didn't need to do, but did anyway, she saw it open. No creak, no sound, just open, and a hand reached out, pale, male, no ring, ink stains on the fingertips. It held a folded note with her name on the front. Mina. She froze, said nothing, watched the hand remain still, patient, as if it had done this before, as if it was used to being seen but never greeted. Slowly she stepped forward and took the note. The hand disappeared. The door shut, just like that. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she placed it carefully in her apron pocket, finished her duties, and returned to her room, where she locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat at her table in silence for what felt like hours. Then, she unfolded the note, typewritten, no signature, no date, just this. They're watching you now, but they think you're harmless. Stay that way. Beneath that, another line. If you find the red book in room 317, do not open it. Do not give it to anyone. Mina read the note 3 times, then again, backward. Room 317 again, the gray-coated man's domain, the room that was supposed to be empty. Was this a warning, a trap, a test? She didn't know. But the next morning, she requested the 3rd floor rotation by mistake. No one questioned her. No one ever did. Room 317 looked like every other room, but it wasn't. The sheets were untouched. The air smelled faintly of oranges and tobacco. The expensive kind, not the kind sold outside train stations. She didn't clean. She searched, quietly, efficiently, with the calm of someone who had done this before. Under the mattress, nothing. Behind the curtains, just dust. Inside the wardrobe, a single coat hanger, empty. But in the drawer of the writing desk, beneath a false bottom made of cardboard and clever nails, she found it. A small red book. No title. No markings. She didn't open it. Didn't even breathe. She placed it back, carefully, and walked out of the room like she'd just replaced hand towels. Back in the linen room, the trap door was closed. She left a note of her own, scrawled on hotel stationery. Found the book, not touching it. Who are you? She folded it into a neat triangle and placed it in the dumbwaiter's latch. It was gone by morning. For the rest of the week, the Bellevue seemed quieter. No sightings of the Russian, no suitcase drama from the American, no strange notes. Even Greta noticed. It's like everyone's holding their breath. Mina didn't respond, but she felt it too. The Bellevue was watching itself now, and Mina Kraus, the maid, The note-taker, the woman with the filing cabinet mind, had just become something she never intended to be, a keeper of other people's danger. The Bellevue was not designed for parties. It was designed for performances. So when the newspapers announced that a selective gathering of cultural elites would be held in its ballroom on the first Saturday of June, no one asked what that really meant. They already knew. It meant champagne fountains and whispered affairs. It meant musicians who never got paid on time. And it meant someone, somewhere, was plotting something dangerous behind a smile. Mina didn't have an invitation. Of course she didn't. But she was there anyway. Apron pressed, hair pinned, eyes open, because the guest list included the American, the Russian, 2 ministers from the interior, a woman who may or may not have been a spy, and a journalist known more for blackmail than for writing. And if that many lies were packed into one room, Mina wanted to be the one folding the napkins. The party started innocently. A band played slow jazz. Waiters danced between tables with trays of oysters and cigarettes. The chandelier above the ballroom glittered like a galaxy about to collapse. Mina was assigned to hallway service, refill towels in the restrooms, handle unexpected requests, keep the outer areas tidy. It was perfect. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, paused near doors, listened, watched. In the south corridor, she saw the Russian, Ivanov, speaking to a woman in a red dress. Their body language was stiff, careful, too careful. In the west stairwell, Hartley, the American, was arguing with someone over a piece of paper. Mina caught only one word: detonator. She didn't react, just kept walking. Around midnight, the lights flickered, only for a second, just long enough for Mina to register the tension in the ballroom. No one screamed. Not yet. Then, smoke. At first it looked like stage fog. A prank, maybe. But when people started coughing, when the band stopped mid-note, when the chandelier swayed like something had hit the roof, that's when panic bloomed. The fire started on the 3rd floor, in the service hallway, the same hallway where room 317 sat, currently unoccupied. Flames licked the wood panels like they'd been waiting. Smoke barreled through the ventilation shafts. By the time the alarm rang, it was too late. Mina didn't run, not at first. She grabbed a linen cart, threw wet towels into it, and pushed it down the hallway toward the fire. People screamed. Men stumbled out of rooms in undershirts. A woman collapsed in the stairwell holding a fur coat over her face. Mina coughed, pushed, soaked towels in a wash basin and stuffed them under doors to buy time. But in the corner of her mind, one thought repeated like a drumbeat: the red book. She had to get it. Room 317 was already hot when she arrived. Smoke curled under the door like a beckoning finger. She kicked it open. Inside, heat, darkness. The wallpaper blistered, but the desk drawer was still intact. She opened it. The red book was gone. In its place, a note. Just one line. Too late. She stumbled into the hallway just as flames overtook the ceiling. Someone grabbed her, a bellboy maybe, and yanked her down the stairs. She didn't remember the rest clearly, only pieces. The glass shattering in the ballroom. The fire brigade yelling in thick Berliner dialect. Greta crying over a broken wrist. A man shouting, "Where's Hartley? Where's Hartley?" But Hartley never came out. Nor did the woman in the red dress. Nor did the bellhop from the 6th floor who once gave Mina free apples. The next morning the Bellevue stood, but barely. Blackened walls, burnt curtains, ballroom destroyed, 4 guests unaccounted for. The newspapers called it an accident. Gas leak, faulty wiring, no one to blame. Mina didn't believe it, not for a second. The linen room was soaked, but still standing. The trapdoor, gone, melted shut. The notebook, she had moved it days before. Some part of her had known. She flipped through it that morning, seated on her bed, feet still blistered, hair smelling like smoke. The entries for 317 she underlined in red pencil. And then, without really thinking, she wrote a final line under Hartley's name. Disappeared in fire, either dead or vanished. The Bellevue would reopen, eventually. Rooms would be restored. Names would be forgotten. But not by Mina. Because she'd seen the notes, the red book, the faces of men who lied through their teeth and women who carried weapons in their lipstick cases. And now, someone else had her name. Florence. The year 1348. A city of towers and bells, of bread ovens and frescoes. And soon, a city of death. The plague didn't knock. It didn't ask permission. It crawled in under doors and inside lungs. Priests choked on prayers. Doctors dropped mid-visit. Children vanished before they ever got a name. But somewhere in all that chaos, there was a boy. He didn't have wealth or training. He wasn't a prodigy. He was just someone who watched. And what he saw, and more importantly, what he drew, would outlive him. Because it changed how we see sickness, how we record it, how we treat it. And here's the twist. He did it all with charcoal, stolen paper, and a memory like a hawk's eye. So if that sounds like something worth staying awake for, subscribe, hit like, and get comfortable. Because this story, it's about quiet brilliance in the loudest moment in European history. Matteo was 14 when the Black Death first whispered into Florence. He didn't hear it from the monks or the merchants. He heard it from the silence. See, his world used to be loud. The bakery ovens where he worked roared from sunrise. Vendors shouted, dogs barked. Bell towers rang like metronomes for the city's heartbeat. And then it began to fade. The shouting turned into murmurs. The bells rang more often, but not for weddings, only for the dead. Matteo lived with his uncle, a baker who woke before the sun and went to sleep smelling like flour and fire. He wasn't kind exactly, but he fed Matteo and let him sketch on used napkins as long as the work got done. "Don't get soft," his uncle would say. "Soft people die fast." Matteo believed him until he saw the ink-colored sores on his uncle's wrists. And by the next week, Matteo was alone. He didn't cry much. He didn't scream. Instead, he drew. With charcoal stolen from the ash pile and napkins rescued from unswept corners, he started sketching. Not buildings, not birds, people. The woman from across the street, the one with a voice like gravel, now had black rings around her eyes. Matteo drew her face, noting how her lips looked thinner. The butcher's boy, coughing blood into his hands. Matteo drew those hands. He didn't know why, only that it felt right to remember things no one else wanted to see. One day, as the ovens cooled and the bakery sat silent, Matteo sat outside drawing a pair of swollen feet. A corpse cart had passed that morning, but this body had rolled off the side and landed near the well. No one dared to touch it. Matteo crouched nearby and drew the purple skin with trembling strokes. That's when the monk saw him. Brother Girolamo was the kind of monk who didn't speak unless it was necessary, which made it odd that he stopped at all. He looked at the drawing, said nothing, then looked at the body, then back at the drawing. "You have a good eye," he said finally. Matteo shrugged. "It's just what I see." "Most people stop looking," the monk replied. "You keep going." He didn't smile. He didn't preach. He just handed Matteo a half-burnt stub of a candle and said, "You'll need light. They're not going to die only during the day." That night, Matteo worked until the wax ran out. He had no teacher, no guide, just instinct. He sketched the progression, the eyes, the hands, the way the jaw stiffened first. He started writing little notes, copying Latin words from a discarded prayer book, even though he couldn't pronounce them. Tumor, necrosis, sanguis, and then his own word, same. He wrote it every time two people had identical symptoms. He didn't know it yet, but he was building something. Not a diagnosis, not a cure, a pattern. Florence kept falling, and Matteo kept drawing. One morning, a widow with shaking hands approached him outside the bakery. "You're the boy with the drawings," she whispered. "Draw my husband so I can show the priest, so he won't be buried like a dog." Matteo nodded. He sketched the face, the lumps, the way the jaw tilted just slightly, something the priests always missed. The next day, a physician showed up with the widow. He looked at the drawing, then at Matteo. "This is better than what I see in my own memory," he muttered. That was the first time Matteo realized someone might be watching him, and that maybe, just maybe, he was seeing what others were missing. The oven stopped burning 3 days after Matteo's uncle died. The sourdough had gone hard on the shelves. The air, once thick with the smell of rising yeast and ash, turned still and stayed that way. Nobody knocked on the door. Nobody wanted bread. Nobody wanted anything, really, except to be somewhere else. But there was nowhere else. By then, the plague had names. The great pestilence, the punishment. Some whispered it was the breath of God. Others said it came from the east, carried on devil ships and silk. All Matteo knew was that it came fast, and once it took hold, it didn't let go. He tried to keep working, sweeping the flour that no one scattered, scrubbing counters that hadn't been touched in days. But it was like pretending a house was still a home after it had burned down. So he left. With a satchel of drawings, 2 crusts of old bread, and his uncle's work knife, Matteo walked. Not far, just into the parts of the city where people still moved, or more accurately, staggered. The city smelled like vinegar and rot. People doused themselves in perfume or garlic, hoping it would drive the disease away. Street preachers screamed into the smoke-filled air, and somewhere, someone had started burning herbs in every alley, like it might cleanse the sin from the bricks. That's when Matteo met Giulio, the gravedigger. Giulio wasn't as grim as his job. He had a back like a wine barrel and skin that had forgotten how to be clean. But he didn't mind company, and he didn't ask questions. Matteo offered him bread in exchange for a floor to sleep on. Giulio accepted with a grunt and a shrug. "If you start coughing, sleep outside." The gravedigger's home was a shack just inside the city walls, near a cemetery that was now more mound than field. Matteo helped where he could, mostly with hauling, sometimes with writing names, when names were known. Often, he just watched. It was here, among death's caretakers, that Matteo's sketches changed. He began to notice things no one was cataloging. The way the swelling started behind the ear, how fingernails turned dark just before the heart stopped, how people who had certain signs, coughing blood, bleeding from the nose, always died within 2 days. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it meant something. So he recorded everything, and now, not just on napkins. Giulio gave him old scraps, parchment, prayer book margins, scraps from burial shrouds, anything that held ink. One morning, he sketched a mother and child. The child was already gone. The mother wasn't coughing, yet. Matteo drew the child's body in detail, the bloating, the black sores, the curve of the neck. The mother sat still as stone. When he finished, she looked at the sketch and whispered, "Will this help someone?" He didn't know what to say, so he said, "Maybe." That seemed to be enough. Soon, word spread, not far, but enough that people started looking for the boy who draws. not for portraits, for warnings. A tailor's apprentice showed him a lump under his arm. Matteo drew it. 2 days later, the apprentice died, just as the drawing had shown. A midwife asked him if certain signs always meant death. Matteo flipped through his stack and pointed to 5 drawings with identical symptoms. "These all died within 2 days," he said, then added, "But this one lived. She drank garlic water." He didn't know if that mattered, but the midwife said, "That's more than the doctors tell us." Matteo started labeling things. He copied what he could from a torn physician's manual he'd found near a corpse cart. It was Latin, mostly, but he tried to match what he saw to what it said. Bubones, pestis, infectio. Sometimes he made up his own symbols, arrows, dots, crosses, little codes only he understood. And soon, a strange thing happened. His drawings began to predict what came next. A woman with red spots would start bleeding from the eyes. A man with stiff fingers would collapse within hours. And when he showed these drawings to people, they began to believe that maybe, just maybe, watching closely could save lives. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying to understand. And maybe that's what made it work. By midsummer of 1348, Florence wasn't a city anymore. It was a graveyard in slow motion. Markets were empty, streets were silent, except for the sound of weeping, coughing, and the occasional scream when another house nailed its door shut from the inside. The bells tolled so often that people stopped listening, and the birds, gone. Even they seemed to know it wasn't safe anymore. Matteo walked through it like a ghost in training. He was still living with Giulio the gravedigger, still drawing, still watching, but now everything was sharper, louder in its quiet. The city was unraveling, and Matteo saw every thread. One morning, he followed Giulio into what used to be a merchant district. Now, it was just rows of houses with painted red crosses on the doors. Giulio pointed. "Only take the ones not moving." That was how it was now. Bodies went out in carts. The sick stayed behind, and those who looked healthy, most of them were just waiting their turn. As Giulio loaded bodies, Matteo crouched near the wall and drew. He didn't even look at the faces anymore. He looked at the order of things, fingers first, then lips, then skin. He noticed that people who coughed early didn't always die, but those who coughed and had black spots by the second day never lasted beyond the third. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't pretend to be, but he was starting to see the rhythm of the plague, like it had a cruel kind of choreography. That's when he met Beppo. Beppo was 12, skin and bones, with eyes too big for his face. He'd been hiding in the bell tower of a nearby chapel, stealing bread from the dead priest's cellar. Matteo caught him chewing on moldy crust. "Don't steal the wine," he warned. "It's vinegar now." Beppo blinked. "Are you going to turn me in?" "To who?" Matteo asked. "Everyone worth telling is already dead." They sat on the chapel steps. Beppo showed him a cut on his leg, small, scabbed, but surrounded by swelling. Matteo frowned and drew it. 3 days later, Beppo was still alive. "You watching me to see if I die?" Beppo asked. Matteo didn't lie. "A little," Beppo shrugged. "Then draw fast." They became an odd pair, Matteo with his satchel of drawings and ink-stained fingers, Beppo with his feral street knowledge and constant sniffles. Beppo started pointing things out. "See her? That's the nun who stopped speaking 2 days ago. That man's got plague hands, all twitchy. My sister had those." Matteo realized something. He wasn't the only one watching, just the only one writing it down. Then came the girl. She was maybe 6, quiet, carried a doll made from rope and rags. Beppo found her hiding under a vegetable cart. Matteo noticed her rash first, like bruises in bloom along her collarbone. He drew her while she sat against a wall. She didn't flinch. The next day, she was gone. Matteo drew that too, just an outline on the street where she had sat. No body, no name, just absence. Later that night, he added a page to his growing collection. Order of symptoms, observed, from rash to rigor mortis. He numbered them. 1. Fatigue. 2. Swollen lymph. 3. Blackened fingertips. 4. Coughing blood. 5. Eye hemorrhage. 6. Stillness. 6 steps, always in that order, not for everyone, but for most. It was the first time he wrote what he had only seen before. Giulio found him sketching that night by candlelight. "You're not scared?" the old man asked. Matteo didn't look up. "I'm terrified. That's why I draw. If I stop, I won't know when it's my turn." Giulio nodded. "You might die smart then." Matteo smiled. "Better than dying blind." The next day, a woman in fine robes, still clean, still healthy, approached him in the street. "You're the one who draws?" she asked. Matteo nodded. "My daughter is dying," she said. "The doctors say nothing can be done, but if you can draw her, maybe someone else will understand someday. Maybe it'll help the next one." She gave him a coin. He didn't want it, but he took it, because now, for the first time, he understood something else. His drawings weren't just records. They were messages. Matteo never expected an invitation to the university district. Most boys his age couldn't even step near the Physicians' Guild without getting chased off by students in long robes with too much perfume and too little experience. But one afternoon, as he was sketching a grocer's swollen jaw on a cracked bench, a man approached him with a strange mix of suspicion and desperation. He wore a black robe, clean shoes, not the usual kind that stomped through Matteo's world. He held a kerchief to his face, as if Matteo smelled like the city itself. "You are the one who draws," he said, not a question. Matteo blinked. "I'm one of them. You drew this." The man pulled a folded, slightly smudged sketch from inside his coat. Matteo recognized it instantly. It was the 6-stage progression he had charted a week earlier. "How did you get that?" Matteo asked. "It was copied. Badly. But it's better than anything we've seen in weeks." The man lowered his kerchief. "You're coming with me." The university was quieter than he imagined. The smell of ink and mildew hung in the air like damp parchment. Most of the scholars had either fled the city or buried themselves in books that had stopped being useful about a century ago. In a small circular chamber, 6 men sat around a heavy table. One stood. He had white hair, hard eyes, and a face like bread left too long in the oven. "This is the boy," the first man said. "The one with the drawings." Silence. Then the old one laughed, not kindly. "You bring us a baker's apprentice? What's next?" "A butcher's dog with opinions." Matteo said nothing, just stood there, clutching his satchel like a shield. "Show us," the white-haired man said finally. "Show us what you've seen." Matteo laid out his drawings slowly, carefully. He showed them the page with the child's hand, purple, blistered, and limp. Then the side-by-side comparisons. 3 men with bleeding gums on day 2, all dead by day 3. He flipped to the diagrams. Circles, arrows, numbered stages. Each sketch came with a date, a name when he had it, a note when he didn't. The room was silent, until one of the younger physicians leaned forward, squinting. "This swelling here, on the neck, you noted it appears before the fever?" Matteo nodded. "Always. Sometimes with coughing, sometimes not." Another doctor spoke. "You drew this one on the 3rd day?" Matteo pointed. "He died on the 4th. The white-haired one frowned. "Coincidence. We have books, treatises. Galen wrote—" "He died 600 years ago," the younger physician snapped. "This boy's seen more plague victims than any of us." The words sat in the room like a knife stuck in a table. Matteo waited. Finally, the older man stood. "Fine, let the boy keep drawing, but we'll decide what it means." That's how it started. Not acceptance, not admiration, permission. He returned the next day with more sketches. One of a man who had bled from the ears. One of a woman who survived despite all signs saying she wouldn't. That one they couldn't explain. Matteo called it the exception. The younger doctors began asking him questions. Did the swelling happen before or after the coughing? How many children survived past the second night? Were the rats always nearby? Rats. That came up more than once. Matteo had drawn them too. Long tails, sharp teeth. He had even sketched bite marks on corpses, on sleeping sick. One physician stared at those pages a long time. "Perhaps it is not divine punishment," he muttered. "Perhaps it is carried." They gave Matteo a real notebook, ink, a proper writing desk in the corner of the chamber. No title, no pay. But it was more than he'd ever had. Beppo laughed when he saw it. "What are you now, a doctor?" Matteo grinned. "Not even close. I just notice things." Beppo nodded. "Keep noticing then, before someone notices you." The city was still dying, but for the first time, someone was listening. And that made Matteo draw faster, smarter, because now he wasn't just drawing for the dead. He was drawing for those who might still live. Florence was drowning in theories. The stars were to blame. Or maybe it was God. Or the air, poisoned by swamps and sin. The physicians argued endlessly in their chambers, swearing by ancient texts and planetary alignments, while outside the carts kept rolling. But Matteo watched the rats. He'd seen them everywhere, slipping between crates, gnawing at fruit in the market, twitching their noses inside church pews. But what struck him most was that they always arrived first, before the coughs, before the bleeding, before the bell towers sang for the dead. They came like messengers, dirty, hungry messengers, and they never stuck around to deliver condolences. It started as a guess, then a pattern, then a certainty Matteo couldn't prove, but couldn't ignore. So he drew. He sketched the rats in fine detail, their bites, their droppings, their curious habit of nesting near firewood. He marked houses where they had been seen and added a simple red R on the edge of his drawings. Rat present. Then he waited, and always within days the sickness followed. He brought the pages to the physicians. A quiet meeting, with fewer voices now. One had died last week, another had fled to Pisa. The older doctors scoffed. "Rats? We are dying by divine mystery and you bring us rodents?" The younger ones leaned in. "This house," Matteo said, pointing. "The tailor's. Rats were seen 2 nights ago. Swelling started yesterday. Today, the child is dead." He flipped another page. "The baker's wife, same rash as 5 others. Rat bites on her ankles." He didn't offer a theory. He offered observations. And for the first time, one of the physicians stood up, walked to the window and said, "He may be right." Still, they refused to say it out loud. The church taught that disease came from sin. The guilds warned that blame could cause panic. But quietly, very quietly, the word rat started showing up in the margins of medical notes. One young physician, Niccolò, approached Matteo after a meeting. "You're seeing it, aren't you?" he whispered. "The trail they leave." Matteo nodded. "Have you drawn what happens after they bite?" "I've tried. Try harder." That night, Matteo followed the trail himself. With Beppo at his side, a slingshot in hand and sarcasm in his teeth, they crept through alleys and market stalls. They found a wine merchant's cellar, crawling with rats. Beppo threw stones. Matteo took notes. One rat was sluggish, sick-looking. Beppo caught it in a sack. Matteo examined it back in Giulio's shack. Swollen neck, discolored eyes. It was dying, and it hadn't bitten anyone, which meant it carried something. He didn't know what. There weren't words for it yet. No knowledge of bacteria or fleas as vectors. But instinct told him, whatever was killing Florence, it had paws and teeth. He began illustrating full scenes. A rat on a windowsill, a child scratching their leg. 3 days later, the child's face darkened. A woman sweeping droppings from the stairs. 4 days later, fever. A map of 10 homes with rat sightings, all now closed behind red-marked doors. He didn't say proof, he just said pattern. The physicians didn't know what to do with it. One burned his notes. Another asked Matteo to keep drawing but leave the rats out. But Niccolò copied everything, sent letters to scholars in Milan, Venice, and even Paris. He called Matteo's work observational pathology. Matteo called it just paying attention. Then came the field test. An abbot, desperate to save his monks, asked the physicians for advice. They gave him garlic, prayers, and Matteo's rat map. The abbot cleaned his monastery, burned the straw, and sealed all rat holes. 3 weeks later, only 1 monk had died. Everywhere else, dozens. It wasn't a cure, not even close, but it was a start, a whisper against centuries of shouting. Beppo said it best one evening, kicking stones into the Arno. "You know, if you were smarter, you'd be rich by now." Matteo smirked. "If I was richer, I'd be dead by now." They both laughed and listened as the bells rang once more. By autumn, Matteo's hands were stained with more ink than flour. He hadn't drawn a loaf of bread in months. Now, his world was pages, loose sheets, folded rags, scraps of parchment, anything that would hold a mark. His drawings were everywhere, tacked to cellar doors, passed to monks, whispered about in alleyways. Some people copied them, not with skill, but with need. Matteo didn't mind. He wasn't chasing credit. He was chasing clarity. But he was running out of space. Giulio, the gravedigger, gave him a wooden crate. "For the dead who aren't buried," he joked. Matteo filled it with drawings, hundreds of them, symptoms, sequences, sketches of rats, airflow paths, skin tones in different stages, notes in broken Latin and in his own shorthand, symbols, arrows, circles. Each page was a story. A child with swelling behind the ears who lived after garlic poultices. A merchant who survived 3 days but died after a nosebleed. A cluster of cases near the fish market that started right after a shipment from Genoa. Matteo had started tracking time. How long from first symptom to collapse? How long from rat to rash? How long Florence had left? But most of these drawings weren't going anywhere. No one wanted records. They wanted miracles. Except for one man. Niccolò, the young physician. He visited often now, no longer mocking, no longer skeptical. He brought Matteo ink, paper, even a writing board, and he brought something else, a request. "I need 10 of your drawings," he said one evening. "Your best. Clear, simple, labeled." "Why?" "I'm sending them to Milan. A physician there is compiling what little we know. Your work, it might be the only thing that's consistent." Matteo hesitated. What if they laugh? Niccolò didn't blink. Let them, but at least they'll see. For 3 nights Matteo worked like a monk possessed. He chose 10 drawings, cleaned them up, rewrote the labels, added tiny red numbers in the corners, his silent system of severity. He wrapped them in cloth, sealed them with wax, and handed them over without ceremony. That package, thin, anonymous, half written in a street boy's hand, would go farther than any priest's sermon. The rest he kept. The napkin archive, as Beppo called it. Dozens of pages folded into a hollow brick under Giulio's shack. Others tucked inside a false bottom bread box. Matteo knew where every one of them lived, because he was afraid they'd disappear, not just physically, but from memory. He'd seen too many things vanish already. The city still gasped through the plague, but something had shifted. Not in the death toll, that still climbed, but in the eyes of people. When Matteo passed, they nodded, not as a savior, not even as a scholar, but as someone who had seen. Even the physicians now spoke to him like a colleague, not a curiosity. Have you seen this symptom before? What do you think this rash means? Could you sketch that hand? He never gave orders, just answers, quiet ones, and sometimes questions no one else thought to ask. But for all the recognition, there was still silence from Milan. No word, no reply, just wind over rooftops and smoke from the burning pits. Matteo told himself it didn't matter, but deep down he wondered, would anything survive? Then, one day, Niccolo returned, grinning. They wrote back, he said, handing Matteo a letter with a broken seal. Your drawings were added to the record. They want more. Copies. Observations. Matteo stared at the page. He couldn't read half of it. The Latin was dense, formal, full of praise hidden behind clauses. But one line stood out. The illustrations are of such clarity that even the illiterate may learn from them. He smiled, then folded the letter and tucked it between his pages. He wasn't a physician. He wasn't a monk. He was just a boy who watched carefully and never looked away. And now his drawings were leaving Florence, spreading like seeds scattered from a dying tree. Does this make you famous now? Beppo asked later that night, chewing a stolen apple. Matteo laughed. Only if rats start throwing me parades. The Black Death didn't end with a bang. It faded, like smoke after fire, like music after the last note. The carts stopped coming every day. The bells rang less. The air smelled a little more like bread again, a little less like ash and vinegar. Florence, or what was left of it, began to breathe. But Matteo didn't feel relief. He felt unfinished, because now that the city was alive again, people were forgetting what they'd seen. The physicians, those who had stayed, returned to their books. They stopped asking Matteo questions. The notebooks disappeared behind shelves. The quiet circle became silent again, this time by choice. Niccolo was the only one who stayed in touch. Barely. Things are calming, he said, as if that explained everything. Matteo asked, what about the letters from Milan? Niccolo hesitated. They're filing them, preparing for the next time. The next time, as if there'd be another. Matteo knew there would be. He didn't stop drawing, even as the sick grew fewer, even as the streets began to smell of wine and garlic again, even as the city painted over its panic with festivals and frescoes. Matteo still drew. He drew the healed, the survivors, the ones who bore the marks but not the scars. He charted neighborhoods, which ones lost the most, which ones resisted longest. He even drew a page titled, What Saved Them? It was mostly blank, but no one asked for his drawings anymore. The archive under Giulio's shack stayed dry and untouched. The bread box where he hid the rat diagrams stayed closed. The world didn't need a boy with a good eye now. It needed bakers again, tailors, priests, hope. Matteo wasn't angry, not really, just hollow. Beppo noticed first. You're quiet, he said one night. Quieter than usual. Maybe I've said everything I needed to. Beppo shook his head. No one like you ever says everything. You just wait for someone to ask again. But no one did. One day Matteo walked into the university's library, not as a guest, not as a student, just a shadow. He found a new medical text being written, the pages fresh, ink still wet. He flipped through it, and there, On page 23 was his drawing, the one with the stages, the numbered circles, his symbols. But his name? Nowhere. The diagram was labeled Illustration by Anonymous Observer, Florence. Matteo blinked. He wasn't sure if it stung. It wasn't stolen. Not really. It was taken, absorbed, used, and maybe that was the point all along. Still, he felt something crack in his chest, quietly, like a shelf giving way under years of dust. Outside, the city buzzed again. A woman haggled over onions. Children kicked a ball. A street preacher yelled about the dangers of idleness. Life had returned, but so had amnesia. Matteo returned to Giulio's shack that night, opened his crate of drawings and stared at them. Some were smeared, some yellowed, some were still sharp as the day he'd drawn them. He didn't burn them. He didn't hide them. He folded them neatly, carefully, placed them between cloth, tied them with string. Then he carried them to the chapel where he had first met Beppo, the one with the cold cellar and the cracked bell. He placed the bundle in a hollow behind the altar and whispered, "If it comes again, look here." Years passed. Matteo became a man. He never became a doctor. He baked again. He taught Beppo to knead dough and not steal so much. But he kept watching, because he'd learned something that the doctors had forgotten. Sometimes the best medicine begins with observation, not with power, not with status, just eyes, patience, and paper. He wasn't remembered. His name faded from records, but his drawings, some survived. One made it to Milan, one ended up in Padua, and one, the rat map, was found in a university archive 3 centuries later, folded inside a medical tome, labeled only Firenze, 1348. It was the year 1794, and Professor Aldo Farini was tired, not from age, though the creaks in his knees said otherwise, but from the weight of paper, decades of it, stacked in corners, stuffed in trunks, forgotten behind doors. The University of Padua had asked him to help organize their archive overflow, which was a kind way of saying, "We don't know what any of this is." Dust floated like ghosts in the dim reading room. The smell of wax, mildew, and forgotten ink hung thick in the air. Farini sighed, cracked his knuckles, and opened yet another ancient tome. It was a medical compendium, printed in the early 1600s, aged, brittle, mostly filled with tedious Latin theories and crumbling pages of Galenic wisdom, all things he had seen 100 times. But in the middle, tucked between chapters like a secret love letter, was something different. A folded sheet, rough, faded, hand-drawn, not printed, not formal, not Latin. Farini's eyes narrowed. He unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile corners. What he saw stopped him cold. It was a map, not of streets, of symptoms, a layout of the human body, surrounded by tiny sketches, swelling in the armpits, blackened toes, blood from the gums. Beside each, little numbers, 1 through 6, and arrows connecting them. Underneath, barely visible in red-brown ink, were circles and the faintest word he could still decipher. Osservato. Observed. Farini leaned back. He wasn't sure why it struck him. Maybe it was the simplicity, the brutal honesty of it. It wasn't theory. It wasn't philosophy. It was lived, seen, sketched by someone who'd stood close to death and looked anyway. He turned the sheet over. No name, no date. But in the margin, a word in an old Florentine dialect caught his eye. Beppo. A nickname, probably. A footnote. A ghost of a person. Still, it made it real. Farini's pulse quickened. The drawing didn't match the handwriting or style of anything else in the book. It didn't belong. It predated the volume by at least 2 centuries. And yet, It was more accurate than anything in the printed chapters. He took it to the university's medical historian. This, Farini said, should not exist. Together, they pored over it, compared it to other plague documents, looked for stylistic matches, and slowly a theory emerged. It must have come from Florence, mid-14th century, Black Death era, likely sketched by a non-academic, possibly an apprentice, someone with no training, and yet an uncanny eye for patterns. They called it the napkin diagram. Even the ink looked homemade. But the observations were cutting edge, centuries before germ theory, before microscopes, before Pasteur or Koch. Farini gave lectures about it, quiet ones. He wasn't a man who loved fame, but he was a man who loved truth. This is what science looked like, he told his students, holding up the fragile page, before it had a name. Some rolled their eyes, some nodded politely, but a few leaned forward, wide-eyed, hungry. He smiled at those ones. He wrote an article, just one, published it in a small academic journal no one outside Padua really read. And in that article, buried in the footnotes, he wrote, "The drawing is unsigned, unclaimed, likely made by a child or layperson. Yet it remains one of the clearest early visual accounts of plague symptomatology we possess. The artist may never be known, but they saw more than the rest." That paper was read by exactly 11 people the year it was printed, but one of them, a British antiquarian named Thomas Ellsworth, clipped the image and kept it in his travel journal, and decades later, that journal would end up in the British Library, right next to a book titled Anonymous Observers of the Black Death, 1347-1351. The sketch, now brittle and laminated, became an academic curiosity, not a revolution, not a headline, but a seed, quiet, persistent, proof that even in the darkest times, someone, somewhere, was paying attention. Florence, centuries later, is a city that wears its history like a silk scarf, elegant, layered, and slightly worn at the edges. Tourists crowd the piazzas, selfies replace sketches, bread still bakes on every corner, and the river still rolls by like it always has. But the memories, the real ones, they're quieter, tucked into corners, fading into frescoes. Inside the Museum of Medical History, a small, dimly lit building just beyond the main square, there's a single, unassuming room. It's not flashy. No tour groups linger here. No one queues up to pose beside the dusty exhibits. But if you step close to the left-hand wall, behind the glass, you'll see a drawing. Just a scrap, really. Faded, torn, fragile. And below it, a brass plaque that reads, "Unknown boy Florence, 1348, observed what others chose to ignore." It wasn't always here. The drawing had spent centuries moving through hands that didn't know what they held. A physician's trunk, a Jesuit library, a Parisian attic. Eventually it was found, mislabeled, in a box of botanical sketches. A curator with a curious eye noticed something odd. "This isn't a plant," she said, squinting. "It's a person, sick. Look here, the rash, the bruising." The page was catalogued, dated, analyzed, and finally displayed. No name, no signature, just quiet brilliance. Some visitors walk past it without a glance. Others pause, squint, then move on to the skeletons and antique scalpels. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone lingers. A med student, a teacher, a quiet kid in the back of a school group. And when they read the description, believed to be the earliest surviving observational drawing of plague symptoms by a non-professional observer, something clicks. Someone once saw what others didn't, and chose to remember it. That plaque wasn't always there either. It was added only recently, after a small Italian newspaper ran an article about the lost drawings of the Florence boy. The piece didn't go viral, but it reached the right inboxes. A historian in Pisa, a medical anthropologist in Boston, a high school teacher in Siena. All of them asked the same thing. Who was he? Of course, no one really knows. But someone dug into old archives, found a bakery record listing a Matteo who stopped baking after the spring of 1348. Another found parish notes about a street boy named Beppo, buried quietly behind the old chapel. And one researcher in Milan uncovered letters referencing the boy with the drawings, sent by a physician named Niccolò. No one could confirm it. But the pieces, they fit. And somehow, that was enough. Now the museum keeps the fragment in a controlled environment, temperature monitored, humidity locked, like it's holding the breath of a time long gone. Children pass by with gelato. Adults check their phones. But behind the glass, Matteo's sketch waits, still, unmoving, but never silent. Sometimes a guide will pause beside it and tell the story, not with flourish, not with drama, but with quiet awe. There was once a boy, they begin, who watched as his city died. He didn't run, he didn't preach, he just noticed and drew. The group nods, one or two smile politely, but occasionally someone lingers a little longer after the rest move on. They press a hand gently to the glass, not to touch, just to feel closer. And in that moment, Matteo is remembered. Not as a doctor, not as a scholar, but as a witness. Beppo once said, "If rats start throwing you a parade, you'll know you've made it." Matteo never got that parade, but he got a plaque, and maybe that's better. They say time erases everything. Names, faces, even the loudest voices fade if given enough centuries. But sometimes, just sometimes, a whisper survives longer than a scream. In Florence, the streets are loud again. Scooters whine past tourists. Children run with gelato-stained fingers. Churches stand silent while their bells gather dust. And yet, beneath it all, there's still a kind of echo. Not one you can hear, but one you can feel. Walk far enough down the side streets, past the glossy storefronts and the shouting vendors. Turn left near the bakery where the line is always too long, and you'll find a quiet plaque on a wall. You might miss it. Most do. But if you stop and read, if you pause for just a second, you'll learn about a boy. A boy with no degree, no status, no titles, just ink-stained fingers and eyes that refuse to look away. Matteo never meant to be remembered. He didn't draw to leave a legacy. He drew because he had to, because what he saw haunted him, and paper was the only way to hold it still for a moment. He didn't know about bacteria, or fleas, or airborne particles, but he watched, and he noticed, he tracked, he sketched. He connected dots no one else could see, because everyone else was too afraid to look. His drawings outlived the buildings they were made in, outlasted the priests, the doctors, the marble graves. They passed through fires and floods, through libraries and marketplaces, ignored, misplaced, almost lost, but not quite. One sketch made it to Milan, another to Padua. A third, the most fragile, was found in a sealed chapel wall during restoration work in the early 20th century. Wrapped in linen, labeled only with one word, osservato, observed. That was all. By now, we know more. We know that the plague came on fleas riding rats, that it wasn't divine punishment or bad air, but microscopic invaders no one could see. But long before microscopes, one boy saw the truth in patterns, and while the world burned, he drew. In modern Florence, medical students study his diagrams in quiet seminars, not because they're scientifically groundbreaking anymore, but because they remind us how science begins, not with brilliance, but with observation. Some visitors leave the museum feeling inspired. Others leave wondering why they'd never heard of him. A few write his name in notebooks they'll lose by next spring, but every now and then someone reads the plaque, the one under the faded sketch, and stops walking. They whisper it softly. Matteo. He's not in the textbooks. There are no grand portraits, no statues in the square, no schools named after him. But there's a drawing, and that drawing didn't fade. Maybe that's enough. So if you ever find yourself wandering through Florence and you feel something quiet and watching, it might not be your imagination. It might be the ghost of a boy with ink-stained fingers sitting somewhere nearby, still drawing, still watching, still reminding the world that even in the darkest moments, someone chose to see, and someone chose to remember. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded that observation matters, that history is made by quiet people too, and that even a napkin drawing can outlive a city. Sleep well, and keep your eyes open.